So today's webinar this is our 27th webinar since we launched in the summer of 2021. And this one is all about Alzheimer's, brain research and brain health. And so this is your opportunity to learn a lot more about what's going on in that field from people who actually know what they're talking about, which I love that. Doesn't happen every day. So we read a lot in the newspapers and a lot of conflicting information. So hopefully we're going to get the straight story here today. And we have Dr. Lotta Granholm, who's a professor in the Department of Neurosurgery at the University of Colorado Medical Campus. Kelly Ostoff, who's the Senior Director of Programs for the Colorado Alzheimer's Association, and Luke Whelan, who's the Director of Community Education and Communication for the ARC of Colorado for Arapahoe, Douglas, and Elbert counties. A little bit about age-wise. As I said earlier, we launched in the summer of 2021, thanks to some funding from the Next 50 initiative. We are working to become the premier nonprofit information and vetted service provider hub for aging Coloradans and their adult children, current and future caregivers. So as it says at the bottom here, we're free to use, but not free to provide. And so why are we even bothering to do this? It's because we have learned over the years, and then you can see this on our demographic slide here, that the 60 and over population is growing at a much faster rate than the other segment of the population. Last year, the line here was crossed between the under 18 population and the over 60 population. So we have a lot of people in the state now, almost about 1.2 million folks over the age of 60, and another 1.5 roughly who are over the age of between 40 and 60. That's where we get into the future caregiving population. We are the second fastest aging state in the country based on the 2010 to 19 census. And that's because of all these folks who moved here. Some of us are on this call today who moved here in a long time ago in the 70s, and we're still here. So the state continues to age. We are here to serve aging Coloradans, caregivers, as I mentioned, employers who have employees in that sandwich generation, and of course our vetted service providers and all organizations committed to healthy and aging Coloradans. This little illustration kind of points out where we are. You know, whether you're in this sandwich generation or on this side of it, we're here to provide help. This is a snapshot from our website that shows the 11 categories of services there. And if you go to the website and find this, you can click on one of those, and every one of those will have a drop-down menu of subcategories and providers. And then I think finally, this is our upcoming schedule of webinars. All of these slides and everything you hear today is being recorded. It will be on our website within a few days afterwards, along with the 27 other webinars that we have. Also, just for your information, we started getting our webinars translated in Spanish with the last 2 that we did. And we hope to continue to do that. So you can see what's coming up here in the next couple of months. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Granholm, who is, as I said earlier, professor at the University of Colorado. She's originally from Sweden and has lived in the US since the 80s. She has a broad research background in neurodegenerative diseases, especially as it pertains to neurodegeneration and aging. She's been funded by the National Institutes of Health for more than 30 years and has more than 170 peer-reviewed articles. She's been working in the Alzheimer and Down syndrome research field for more than 30 years. So Lotta, I'll turn it over to you now and take it away.
Thank you very much, Bob. I'm happy to be here today. I'm having little technical issues, but let's try this and see if it works. So I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about, I'll do an introduction of brain health and aging. We all want to have a healthy brain, of course. And I will talk a little bit about healthy aging and also where it leads us in terms of different forms of dementia, in particular Alzheimer's. So, we know very strongly that lifestyle affects healthy aging. And so this is just two images of two people that are well known to all of us. They're about the same age, 2 years different, but when you look at their face, Keith Richards versus Goldie Hawn, there's a huge difference, right? But aging doesn't just sit on the outside. It's actually what you've done in your life that forms these lines on your face and elsewhere that actually make you more beautiful, more wise, and more interesting. And George Bernard Shaw, I always love the sayings that he had about different things. He talked about aging, that it's who you are on the inside that matters. We don't stop laughing when we grow old. We grow old when we stop laughing. And I think that is so true. So I'm hoping all of you are laughing a lot and that you're trying to enjoy life. So some people have been really successful at enjoying life, and that is those people in the blue zones. So the blue zones are 5 places in the world. There's one in California, Loma Linda. There's Costa Rica, Sardinia, Greece, and Okinawa, where people are as exceptional at living well. And we know that because many of them become over 100 years old. So here we call that a centenarian, someone over 100. And there are several different factors. And I will also tell you right from the get-go, it's a marvelous website, the Blue Zones website, and the recommendations that are made there. It's actually about 9 different staples of lifestyle are actually very successful. In fact, the researchers involved in the Blue Zones think that these 9 recommendations can lead to 10 or 15 years longer lifespan. So it's not trivial, it's very important. We all know that we're guilty, for example, of eating too much food. The people in the blue zones, they eat until they're 80% full. We also know we should be moving naturally, like this man here with his sheep. This is a great website called respectfullife.com if you haven't seen it. It's very interesting. But it's also diet, it's exercise, and some geographic properties. And I will tell you also that of these sites, most of them have a glass of wine, a glass of red wine or so, per day, because it actually increases, it has so many good things in the grape. And if you don't want to drink wine, you could drink grape juice, for example. But these recommendations are really the staple of lifestyle that will get you to healthy aging, but also will reduce the risk for Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. The most important factor, though, is optimism. So that what they showed when they studied the centenarians is that there was one thing that was common to all the 5 sites and all the centenarians. They were all optimistic. And so I think this cartoon says it all, but it's really so important to be optimistic. My mother became 92. She had a lot of sorrows and problems in her life and also a lot of health issues, but she was an optimistic person. And so she had a full life, and I know that there are, for example, classes that teach people to be more optimistic, but the hopeful outlook is absolutely essential. And that's true whether you have any of the chronic conditions that we can actually look at here. 10 common chronic conditions for people over 65. All of these will actually benefit from an optimistic outlook, believe it or not. And so you can see that there are, several different chronic conditions. Many people, if they're over 65, will actually might have 1 or 2 or several of these different conditions at the same time. And those conditions or diseases that affect the brain are, of course, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, ALS, stroke, for example, and all of these 4 neurodegenerative diseases, like we call them, are affected by lifestyle factors, the blue zone factors. And if, for example, you take care of your cardiovascular disease by getting medication, exercising, losing weight, or whatever, that will also improve or reduce your risk for getting Alzheimer's disease. So it's very, very important. So I'm sure you've heard of dementia, you've heard of Alzheimer's, but there are many different types of dementia, and Alzheimer's is just one type. So in my lab, we're studying several different types of dementia. Of course, Alzheimer's disease. We're also studying Down syndrome-related Alzheimer's, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We're studying concussion-related dementia and CTE, which is a relatively new disease that happens to people with multiple concussions. We also work on vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, and Lewy body dementia, to mention just a few. And so many of these types of dementia affect the same areas of the brain and have some of the same biological mechanisms. So we also actually think that treatments might be similar. A lot of them have in common, for example, that there's inflammation in the brain. So we're now thinking about anti-inflammatory drugs for treatment of many of these dementias. So I think dementia is extremely common. We all have someone in our family. Also in the more famous families, we know, for example, that Winston Churchill had a form of dementia, that Margaret Thatcher, Pat Summitt, who's a basketball coach, Barbara Smith, who's a model and also a TV chef, Robbie Williams. All of these people have in common that they had a form of dementia. And dementia happens all over the world. And I know that Kelly will talk about this in a little while. The different rates of dementia actually hits all different populations. It hits more severely in minority populations, for example, in Hispanics and African Americans, but it hits everyone, men and women, and sometimes also younger people in their 40s will get dementia. So today I wanted to focus on Alzheimer's disease. We have limited time, and so we have to focus on the most common form of dementia. And I just mentioned, the difference, the distinction between, if you hear that your loved one has dementia, it could be Alzheimer's, but it could be CTE, or it could be vascular dementia or anything else. Alzheimer's disease is the most common. There's a very small subgroup of people with Alzheimer who have an inherited form. And most people with an inherited form will actually get dementia and Alzheimer's disease earlier in their life, maybe even in their 40s. The most common form is what we call sporadic Alzheimer. That means we don't know why it happened. The definition in the brain, and I will actually show you some of these pictures later of the brain, but the definition in brain is that there's a progressive increase in several different pathological features in the brain. There's something called a plaque. The plaque is formed by a protein called amyloid. There's something called a tangle. Tangles are formed by another protein called tau. And so plaques are outside the nerve cells, tangles are inside the nerve cells. And because of these plaques and tangles, we have loss of nerve cells. We also have massive inflammation that is chronic and continuous. And we have oxidative stress, which means that the brain is stressed and it's unable to deal with the stress. That's why nerve cells die. And so actually you could see it in the entire brain. What we do I was the director for the South Carolina Brain Bank, and now I'm leading a brain bank, an international brain bank for Down syndrome-related Alzheimer. And when the brain comes in, we have to weigh the brain and see what it weighs. And you can see here on the picture, I don't know if you could see my arrow, but on the left here is a normal brain that weighs about 1,500 grams. On the right is a brain with Alzheimer's, and that weighs much, much less. Because what happens actually is that the brain will shrink. Nerve cells die, and the hollow spaces inside will get larger, and then there's less brain tissue overall. So if we look more closely, at the microscopic level, what it looks like in the brain, what we see is that we talked about amyloid and tau up here. And the bottom left picture here, you can actually see in blue, that is an amyloid plaque that's forming in the brain, and several small ones. So it sits between the cells, and it's very toxic to the cells, and eventually the cells will die. And the top right picture here is actually a picture of a tangle. So that contains a very dangerous protein that is toxic to nerve cells called tau. And then we talked about the brain shrinkage. You can see the red brain here, that's Alzheimer. The green brain is normal. And here at the bottom right is actually showing these cells that are inflammatory cells. And they are ramped up in the Alzheimer brain. We don't know why. So now people are actually making medications that will deal with inflammation, because we think that if inflammation goes down, then the tau and the amyloid will also go down, because they are sort of fed. It's like a fire, you're feeding it with inflammation and you get more and more of it. So how do you diagnose Alzheimer's? You can either go and get a imaging. You can either have an MRI or a PET imaging. And the colorful pictures here show you what two different forms of PET. So what PET is that they inject something in your blood vessels that binds to specific sites in the brain. And that can show you at the top. It could show you the top right here if you have lots of tau tangles, and the bottom here if you have amyloid plaques. So the brighter the color, the more plaques and tangles you have. But you can also just look at a common MRI, and what you will see is that certain parts of the brain will actually shrink. And you can measure the shrinkage from one year to another, and then that's how you can diagnose Alzheimer. They have now novel biomarkers in blood or in the cerebrospinal fluid or CSF. And that's also something that is done especially at university clinics. And then most of all, your neurologist will propose a cognitive test, meaning he or she will test your memory function. And if you look at your memory function over the years, you could see a decline with Alzheimer, and that's another way to diagnose. And of course, your activities of daily living. Are people no longer able to drive? Can they not go shopping themselves? Can they not handle their phones? They're very important. And then finally, the only final diagnosis that we know specifically which form of dementia somebody had is post-mortem after someone has died. We can look at the brain. So that's what we also do in my lab. We look at the brain and then we let the family know this is the form of dementia your loved one had. And sometimes if that's an inherited form, it's important for family members to know that. And it also gives you closure. So these are the different diagnostic tools. Now I want to change a little bit and talk a little bit about Down syndrome. So when I was in graduate school, people with Down syndrome only lived until their early 20s. And so they did not grow old. And so they did not have all of these age-related conditions that we now see. There's about 300,000 people with Down syndrome in the USA. And the way it's diagnosed is with a chromosome test. You see the little blue image here in the middle. And what you see here is these orange dots. These are different chromosomes. And the 3 orange dots represent 3 copies of chromosome 21. And that is then technically, that's a diagnosis for Down syndrome. Their average life expectancy now is actually 60 years old. And so you can see that bar graph down here. This is when I was in graduate school. They lived to 25, and now they've increased their lifespan this much. And we think, or we know, this is because of many of the comorbidities or conditions that people with Down syndrome would die from before have actually now been medically treated. 50% of them have sleep apnea, for example. That will affect their cognitive abilities. Imagine having constant lack of sleep. They have heart defects. They're born with heart defects, hypothyroidism, vision, hearing loss, all of these different things. And then they also have intellectual disabilities, but it's a variable degree. And researchers have now shown, that's why it's in yellow at the bottom, that people with Down syndrome can undergo a lot of training, cognitive training, physical training. And if they do that during their childhood and even during adulthood, they can actually improve their functionality, improve their cognitive performance. So they are living with better quality, they're living longer. And we now also have diagnostic tools that we could use to diagnose Alzheimer's disease in Down syndrome. So this shows you here a little bar graph at the bottom that my former student, Eric Hamlet, is now a director for a brain bank. But Eric did this bar graph showing you that the purple is the Down syndrome population, the red is the US population. And this is prevalence of Alzheimer's disease in Down syndrome or general. So you can see that when people are in their 50s, 40% of them already have dementia symptoms now. And when they're in their 70s, it's actually between 70 and 90%. It hits all generations. Oh, sorry, that did not mean to happen. It hits all different generations and equally in populations. And there are very few medications that are available. But now, together by an international network of people, we're developing better diagnostic tools and better treatments. So the pathology in the brain from someone with Down syndrome is very similar to pathology in Alzheimer. You can see at the bottom left here, these are images that's called a silver staining. You see all those little black dots that's in the brain from someone who's 61 years old with Down syndrome. And the one on the left is a control that's 63 years old. So you essentially see all of the components of inflammation, as in the bottom right, tau, amyloid, all of these things happen. So the blue dots here, that's plaques, amyloid plaques, and the brown stains here in the nerve cells, that's tangles. You just see it at a much, much earlier rate and at a much higher speed. It's happening between, you can start seeing these changes in the brain when someone is 30 with Down syndrome. So it's a much, much earlier than you normally see in people with Alzheimer, in sporadic Alzheimer. So we have developed different new biomarkers that would allow us to look earlier in Down syndrome. And with this cartoon here at the bottom right shows you, this is a big bubble here. These bubbles contain a lot of stuff. The whole thing is a cell. And these little bubbles in the middle of the cell here are called exosomes, and we can call them bubbles. Every cell in the body releases these bubbles, and out in the bubbles come different components. So, for example, the cells in the brain that is going to have Alzheimer in the future, it will release the bubbles with the content of amyloid and tau. So now we can actually know long before, because the nerve cells in the brain get sick 20 years before you can see any clinical symptoms. So by measuring these bubbles, the bubbles will then go actually from brain out to blood. We can purify the bubbles that came only from the brain, and we can look at the content. And so we did this in a large cohort, a large group of people that had Down syndrome, the black dots here to the left, or people who did not have Down syndrome. And we measured then amyloid on the left and tau on the right by age. And what you actually see that the black dots are people with Down syndrome. They actually had amyloid in these bubbles, and they had tau in these bubbles when they were 5, 10, 15 years old, meaning that you can actually diagnose what is to come much, much earlier. And so this was a huge study, because each of our different sites, we don't have enough patients to do a gigantic study, but it proves that we can use this novel technology. It's not on the market yet, but we can use the technology to actually look also in sporadic Alzheimer in everyone. Do they have amyloid and tau? That's actually a sure sign that in the future you might develop Alzheimer's. So it's an early diagnostics. So now I'm going to switch a little bit. I don't know how I'm doing time, but I'm trying to not take too much time of the other speakers here. I would just.
You're good, but you're good, Lotta.
I'm good. Okay, that's good. All righty. So let's turn a little bit to treatments, and the treatments from now on, the slides that I show from treatments and lifestyle are actually equally important, both for people with Down syndrome or other IDDs and the general population who are afraid of or worried about or have been diagnosed with mild Alzheimer's. So it's really for all types of Alzheimer. So I'm just done a little summary slide here that shows you both the existing and also some of the new treatments that are coming on board now. The top lines here are acetylcholine esterase inhibitors. You might know this as Aricept. That's the most common medication that probably if you go to a general physician and he or she suspects that you might have dementia, they would first put you on Aricept. Aricept has many severe side effects, and it only has sort of a symptomatic function. So it's not going to work against the nerve cells dying. It will just treat the symptoms, which memory loss, anxiety, all of those different symptoms. The next one is Namenda. It's a newer medication. And Namenda actually blocks certain chemicals in the brain that are toxic. So it might actually have sort of a disease modifying effect that we're not sure. It's also a symptomatic medication. It also has some problems with side effects. The next one is anti-inflammatory treatments, and you might have heard Dr. Huntington Potter at CU talk about his new anti-inflammatory treatment for Alzheimer. And I actually am one of the proponents for these treatments. I know for sure that inflammation is feeding the flame of amyloid and tau. And inflammation, we don't understand why, but people who have Alzheimer have sort of a ramped up inflammatory response. And so if we were able to actually slow that down or resolve the inflammation, I think it's a very important family of drugs that might be coming in the near future. Then comes the next category is amyloid vaccines. You've all heard about lecanemab, aducanumab, and so on. And these are very highly controversial. And I have on the next slide, I will talk a little bit more why they're controversial. So I won't dwell on that here, but they have very severe side effects, for example, and they only treat amyloid, which is not the only component of this disease. And the last two lines to me are very interesting. We're working in our group with these two. Cell replacement therapy, for example. You can see this beautiful picture here on the right side here. Can you see it? That's actually a little transplant of a peripheral nerve, a small piece of a peripheral nerve from a patient that has then been processed and transplanted into the brain of the same patient. So there's no rejection, that like you would have with a kidney transplant or a heart transplant. And what it shows us here, this little image here, is that there are cells actually in peripheral nerves that are really good at repairing. They produce these products that are beneficial for cells and they can repair cells. And so this is a project that we do together with University of Kentucky, where we're actually trying to take these small nerve graft segments and putting them in the brain. And the data, we've done about 80 patients now, I think. The data are very, very promising, but it's experimental still at this point. The last one is gene therapy, and this has been going on for quite a while. For example, at UCSD, they also implant a specific gene, which you do when you do gene therapy. You have a gene that's altered, and then you place it in sort of a virus that contains that gene and it infects the brain. But it's very, untoxic viruses, for example, the common cold or whatever. And the virus carries with it a specific gene that is missing in Alzheimer's brains or reduced in Alzheimer's brains. So these are new things on the horizon and very interesting. So, I would like to talk a little bit. I've just mentioned this briefly about the different amyloid vaccines because they are on the horizon as the big new thing in Alzheimer's disease. The problem with these, at least aducanumab and lecanemab, result in brain swelling up to 30% of the patients, and this can actually be lethal. There are also, you can look on the X-ray of these patients that have received the vaccines. There are what we call ARIA, which are amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. Essentially, if you remove these plaques, there will be holes in the brain. The holes can be inflamed. So it's like creating a Swiss cheese and you don't know what's going to go inside the holes, essentially. They interrupted one trial because they saw inflammation of the brain in as much as 6% of the patients. And they also have fairly small effects on the memory or cognitive abilities. So they're interesting. It's a new field of research, these amyloid vaccines, but they're not going to solve everything because amyloid is not everything. And what every patient would have to ask themselves is, are these side effects and these severe side effects, are they tolerable? And so, the research says that they're coming with better and better ones that would cover more and more amyloid, and maybe in combination with other medications, it might work. What I do believe more in is actually risk prevention. And so there's a study, I don't know if you've heard about it. It's very easy to find it at www.fingers.com, called FINGER. It stands for the Finnish Geriatric Intervention Study to Prevent Cognitive Impairment and Disability, a long name. But essentially, it's a colleague and friend of mine, Mia Kivipelto, who's a professor at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, who started this in Finland and came up with risk factors and protective factors. And we know that protective factors are, for example, high education, physical activity, active lifestyle, fish oils like omega-3 and so on. And that we know the risk factors are stroke, high blood pressure, cholesterol levels, obesity, diabetes, smoking, and so on. And now her study has actually gone worldwide. And what we are talking to Mia about is being able to add a finger DS. So we do also these studies, these preventative studies in people with Down syndrome. It's very important. These studies have not been done in Down syndrome. Only have a couple of slides left. I just want to talk a little bit about COVID-19. It's on everybody's mind. And for people with Down syndrome, it's especially on their mind because they have a 10 times higher mortality rate for COVID-19 than others do. It's also true that patients with Alzheimer have increased mortality rate. And the interesting thing with chromosome 21 is that it actually has several segments on it that are either protective or make it worse, COVID-19. So now we're doing a study with other investigators looking at the brains of people that died from COVID-19 and either had Down syndrome, Alzheimer, or were controls. And so this image here shows you these little black dots here are actually nerve cells in the brain that contain the virus. So we didn't even know from the beginning, could the virus get in? And it really is. And the results from the study, we're going to actually go to a conference in 2 weeks and talk about these results. But they show that the immune cells in the brain are less able to deal with the virus, especially in Alzheimer and Down syndrome. And so it's something that I think we will carry with us for a long time. We will actually have a surge of Alzheimer cases coming up in the next 10 or 20 years after this pandemic because of what happens in the brain of people if they have even a mild risk for Alzheimer. The international network, who has been responsible for working on all these different studies that we have, is located at CU Anschutz. I'm the lead PI for the brain bank part of it. And you can see it's a whole group of very friendly faces from both Europe and the US working on this, because we feel that people with Down syndrome have been neglected. They have not received the diagnostics, they have not received treatments, and they really deserve that attention. So with that, I'm going to end with this slide here and talk about the different factors. So we know, just to summarize, that Alzheimer's and other dementias are the perfect storm. There are several things that happen in the brain, and there are several risk factors. And I would actually like to add COVID as a risk factor here. But we can do things. We can work on early detection methods like the bubbles I talked about. We can exercise, we can reduce stress, we can battle inflammation and reduce systemic conditions, for example, cardiovascular. So there are things that we can do. There is hope. And my bet is actually that the lifestyle factors that we can all really do to prevent this, but also slow the progression, that they will have more massive effects. I know it to be true, more massive effects than medications do. And with that, I will thank you, and I'll take any questions.
So
there's my email also, if anyone wants it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Laura. That was really good. Very interesting stuff.
Thank you.
We had a couple of questions in the chat, and then I have a few questions of my own. So the first question came from JJ Jordan. What inflammation drug of Dr. Potter's are you referring to?
It's the leucine.
Okay.
It's that one. That one works on the inflammatory systems in the brain.
Okay.
And it's the same principle as we have for our cell replacement, where you take sort of peripheral tissues and peripheral. It's actually a macrophage, which is a peripheral cell, and you introduce it into the brain because it has more regenerative ability than the brain itself has.
And we had a question about nutrition, but I think you kind of answered it. And that is that nutrition does play a huge factor in the onset of Alzheimer's, and keeping it at bay,
Oh, absolutely. I know that personal examples, someone that Kelly also knows well. And so I know that it can actually do much better than the drugs can, I think, at this point.
And back to this COVID thing, because a lot of people have had COVID. Some people have had it more than once,
Yeah.
twice. Some severe, some not so severe. Some people got it intentionally early on to thinking that they would have immunity.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more about the impact of all those decisions and all those things that just happened to people along the way, and how serious does the COVID have to be to actually have an impact on this disease later in life?
That's a really great question. And I just wrote a review paper on this. And what I found out while writing that was that even people, we talk about long COVID and neuro COVID. And so effects on the brain, it can happen in both conditions. And actually it's true. Also now studies are coming out showing that people with just mild symptoms can still get an infection of the brain. The virus can be in the brain and the virus can rest there. They've shown with other viruses that they can rest in the brain and then come back. We know it for shingles, for example, come back decades later or years later. And so, although we don't know much yet, we're hoping to find out. But what we do know is, for example, that vaccines can definitely prevent severe infection. I am certain about this. And all of I just looked at the AARP website. They have a great Mythbuster site. Have you seen that, Bob? About the myths that are associated with vaccines and anti-vaxxers. So I will actually encourage everyone to look at the AARP if you're wondering about the vaccines. It's scientific, it's straightforward, and it's true. What it says there is true. And so we wouldn't have to believe media, I don't think. But it's a beginning field, and unfortunately, it's a field we'll have to continue with, because just like with flu, we're not going to get rid of COVID-19 or the coronaviruses. It will continue. So there will be a wave of new Alzheimer cases, unfortunately. Eat well, exercise, do all of the lifestyle factors, and that's how we prevent the onset and prevent progression, truly.
So if we haven't gotten on board the nutrition and exercise, get on board now.
Yeah. And then, for example, omega-3s, you eat salmon. If you eat salmon, you live longer and your memory is better. It's true.
That sounds pretty simple.
It's very simple.
Another thing, you mentioned getting these cognitive checks periodically. Are there recommendations on when you should start doing that and how often you should do that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I was just yesterday at my doctor's office, and I'm turning 65 this year. So I said to him, I wish that, in addition to the colonoscopy, that when we turned 50, maybe we would have, an annual memory test. And now it's so simple. There are actually apps that you can just go on your phone and look for an app that is sort of a simple memory test and do it on yourself. And then you don't have to tell anybody else. But I think it should be something that is, because people in your family might notice a decline, but you may not notice it yourself. So I'm actually thinking I'm going to start doing that now.
I think that's a great idea. And also just back to the COVID thing for just a second, but my healthcare provider hasn't said anything about that. I'm sure most haven't, like, hey, you've had COVID and now you have an increased risk. And so if you've been thinking about losing weight, thinking about exercising, eating better, that would be a good time to start. I don't think we hear that enough.
I don't think the doctors don't know it yet. They don't know, but if you start reading, there are more and more papers coming out, so you can actually drown in all the papers. So simple messages. Maybe I should write something in the Denver Post about this.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think, all of us too, when we see our physician, we should mention it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the last question before we move on here. So Loma Linda, okay, it's in the United States. Why is it in the blue zone?
Well, there's a religious order now. I think they're called Seventh-day Adventists. And so they have a very strict lifestyle that they follow. So it's the Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda. I wouldn't call it a sect, it's a religion and a sort of a community. But it's also, what I didn't mention, is a strong sense of community actually gives us a longer lifespan. And so many of us have mothers or fathers or aunts and uncles who sit isolated and don't have any contact with anyone. This was actually, as you know, in our group, when we talked about aging, the biggest problem in aging in Denver, for example, or in Colorado, is isolation. My mother lived a very rich life. She was never isolated from anyone, and she lived a long life despite several chronic diseases. So, these are all important topics, I think.
Excellent point.
Yep.
And we have one more thing. Oh, okay, I got it. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And we should have some time for more questions later.
Okay.
Next, I'm going to introduce Kelly Osthoff. Kelly is in addition to her role at Alzheimer's, she is a gerontologist and leads the Care and Support Division of the Colorado chapter of the Alzheimer's Association, and represents the organization on the governor-appointed Colorado Commission on Aging, the State of Colorado Alzheimer's Disease and Related Dementias Advisory Committee, and the Department of Health and Human Services Colorado Dementia Partnership Committee. She's currently pursuing a PhD in gerontology with a research focus on dementia caregiving in multi-generational families. Kelly, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Bob. Give me 1 minute as I make sure I share my screen properly. Like Lotta, I'm trying to experiment with the double screen, which sometimes makes it harder than it needs to be. But Lotta, it's such a pleasure to speak after your excellent presentation. I think that you so beautifully painted the landscape of aging, healthy aging, aging well, whatever resonates with you, and also cognitive aging, and painting a picture of what we know about the science as it relates to cognitive aging. It was just fantastic to listen to you. I'm here today to share a little bit more about the kind of bird's eye view, the larger picture of Alzheimer's and dementia science, and more specifically, the role that the Alzheimer's Association plays in that scientific landscape. I also look forward to then handing the microphone over to Luke, who will continue to contextualize how this topic, more specifically, aging, cognitive aging, the study of aging, relates to the disability community, and more specifically, including those with Down syndrome. So let's get started. If you're unfamiliar with the Alzheimer's Association, our work is about people and science. So what I like to say is, as an organization, we are not only service providers, but we are also a public health organization that is leveraging policy, funding, research to advance the research on Alzheimer's disease. We're also here to help people currently caring for someone with dementia, living with dementia, or their community. Here's an overview of our resources. So if you're interested in community education, caregiver support groups, family care consultation, I encourage you to reach out either locally or through our 24/7 helpline, where someone will answer the phone day or night. As Lotta said, the Alzheimer's Association tracks data, large population and epidemiological and demographic data as it relates to Alzheimer's and dementia. And currently, there are more than 6 million Americans living with Alzheimer's or another form of dementia. We estimate that even though 1 in 3 seniors over the age of 85 has some form of dementia and dies with some form of dementia, not all older Americans have dementia, and that's an important point to make in the conversation on aging. We also know that a large group of Americans are providing unpaid care to family members and friends with dementia. We know that certain populations of people carry a higher either prevalence or incidence as it relates to dementia. Lotta spoke to some of the unique considerations on a population level for those with Down syndrome, but we also know that almost 2/3 of Americans with Alzheimer's are women and people of color, including communities who are Black or African American and Hispanic or Latino, are disproportionately more likely to develop Alzheimer's or other dementia at 2 and 1.5 times as likely, respectively, rather. This is further complicated when you take into consideration additional risk factors that include, but is not comprehensive, poor diet, poor physical exercise across the lifespan, lack of sleep, and low levels of social and cognitive engagement across the lifespan. And that's why, rather, as an organization, we are advocating for more diversity and inclusion in the research. The Alzheimer's Association raises funds to fund research. Currently, we have over $310 million invested in over 950 projects across the globe. This, to me, paints the picture of the complexity of this disease and the scale at which we're going to, as a society, need to tackle this. This research not only is funding healthy research and lifestyle work that Lotta talked about, but is funding basic science as well. So across the landscape of science, the Alzheimer's Association funds. It's also important to note that the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, has invested over $3.5 billion in Alzheimer's and dementia research. And so, even though we're the largest nonprofit funder here at the Alzheimer's Association, when you look at all funders overall, the US government is the largest funder and the association comes in third. Now, we believe that it is an exciting time in the science, but we're not done with our journey through the scientific exploration as it relates to dementia and Alzheimer's. We do know, however, that we need to study risk from all angles, and we know that there are both non-modifiable and modifiable risk factors shown here that are key to implementing across the lifespan to help someone maintain their overall health and lower their risk of dementia. We're also discovering that the disease is present asymptomatically in the body or in the brain up to 20 years or more before someone is and can be clinically diagnosed at this current time in the clinical setting. What this tells us is that there's more exploration that needs to be done in the biomarker space in order to detect and diagnose Alzheimer's sooner and better manage it, possibly as a chronic condition earlier in the lifespan. This paints a really hopeful picture in the scientific landscape, but certainly we're not done yet. I'm going to skip over this slide because Lotta, you described it so beautifully, the basic science behind Alzheimer's disease. But I want to show this image because it paints the current picture of where the pharmaceutical therapy landscape exists today. And again, I want to emphasize that none of these treatments are the silver bullet to treating or curing Alzheimer's. And in fact, there is certainly much more work that needs to be done. And Lotta beautifully described some of the areas where she finds hope in the scientific landscape. What these first kind of group of drugs do that are taken by pill form, if you will, sometimes patch, is that they manage some of the underlying symptoms related to the disease, but they're not considered disease-modifying therapies. The two more recent introductions to the market, aducanumab or Aduhelm, lecanemab and Leqembi, while delivered through an intravenous method, they have received more recent FDA approval and are available to the larger public, but not covered by Medicare at this point. It represents a moment of hope in the science where it is the first discovery where a pharmaceutical therapy has been FDA approved to target amyloid. Certainly we're not done here, but if we're going to have something that works down the road, there needs to be a starting point, and that really is our stance as an organization. We also feel that these therapies may not be appropriate for every patient, but we do believe in the underlying right of patient choice and for the patient to be able to have options. I know of a gentleman, more specifically, who is on one of these therapies. And even though he is getting it through a clinical trial, and that is how he is gaining access to it, and it is not widely available for the larger public, primarily because of cost, he really feels that Aduhelm is enhancing his quality of life, and he thinks that it is enhancing his cognition. And so coupled with other lifestyle modifications that he's making, this is a really appropriate treatment at the time for him. And we want to support someone like him, but also someone who possibly chooses not to seek these treatments and make other modifications that are rooted in science that Lotta discussed. Like Lotta also mentioned, there's over 140 unique therapies being tested in clinical trials at the moment that include a number of different things. How our cells communicate, the tau tangles in addition to the amyloid beta tangles, the neuroinflammation that possibly exists. And it is the larger picture of science that really gets the Alzheimer's Association excited and hopeful. In the future, that we know that if we find some way to modify or treat or delay Alzheimer's by just 2025, this slide always strikes me because by 2025 used to feel so far in the future. And in reality, that's just 2 years away. And certainly in my tenure in this work, we've seen quite a few advancements in the science in just over the last 10 years, for example. But we know that if we continue that momentum, and if we have something that delays the onset in 2025 by just 5 years, so it would give someone 5 years more of cognitively healthy years, we would prevent nearly 5.7 million people who would otherwise be expected to develop Alzheimer's in 2050. They would not. And it is because of this population size impact that could be done in this scientific pursuit that we see hope in the current landscape. So thank you so much for joining today. We're always here to engage with you on this topic. And we hope that you join us in our vision of a world without Alzheimer's disease and all other dementia. But no, until that point, we're here to be an accurate source of information, an accurate source of educational tools and resources. And I will say that is both related to the science and the research landscape, but also to families facing dementia in the day and age where there is no pharmacological treatment at the point in time. We believe there's a lot of other tools that can help families, and we're delighted to partner with you all in this journey. So thank you so much for the time. I will pass it over to my co-panelist, Luke, if there are no questions. And these slides will be available for your review.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kelly. That was great. I had just a couple questions for you. One, you mentioned education, on the part of the Alzheimer's Association. So does that extend to healthcare providers about the, I keep thinking about this COVID thing. So educating those folks, I mean, not only on that, but also on making sure that they mention this cognitive testing, that people should do it. Okay, there are places you can do it online. We can do it in the doctor's office, whatever. But I know my doc does require the cognitive testing every year, which is a good thing. But I don't know that all of them do that. So
that's such a great question, Bob. And one of the things to consider is that this issue is being tackled from so many different angles. So not only is it being tackled from the scientific perspective, for example, potential funding or convening of researchers that are looking at the tools we use to detect and diagnose Alzheimer's disease. But we're also tackling that issue from a policy perspective. The Alzheimer's Association and our advocacy arm was integral in passing legislation more colloquially known as the Hope for Alzheimer's Act, and other legislation that incentivizes providers to do this dementia care. So more specifically, there is a Medicare or a code through CMS, the Center for Medicaid Services, that providers can bill to that reimburses their time and therefore incentivizes them to offer that cognitive assessment at the annual wellness exam covered through Medicare. So the Alzheimer's Association was the one that called for that legislation, got it achieved, sought funding for it, and is now working on the implementation of that policy change. We're working through that policy change and implementation through working directly with health systems on provider education related to the code. So to me, that's just one example of how we're trying to make, as an organization, kind of larger population level change that improves the overall quality of life of people who are living with dementia, but also older adults and people in general who are concerned about their cognitive aging.
okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay, now we're going to hear from Luke. Luke Wayland is the Director of Community Outreach, Education, and Communication for the ARC Colorado. I mentioned that earlier. Luke's Colorado native, born and raised in the Denver Metro, and has a degree in sociology from Colorado State University. So during his life, he has witnessed firsthand the transition and steady progression of the quality of life options for individuals with disabilities, as his parents worked in the IDD field for over 35 years. So Luke grew up around people with disabilities and individuals striving to achieve independence and meaningful life. And I think that's why he's doing what he's doing today. But Luke can tell you more about that. So take it away, Luke, please.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for, again, having us here to present today. And then, Kelly and the Alzheimer's Association for all their work, but also their inclusiveness for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, which I'll use the acronym IDD moving forward, but It stands for Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. And also to Dr. Glenholm and her colleagues for just their work and time they've putting into the study of the brain and things for us. Quickly, yeah, the ARCs. So I work for the ARC, Arapahoe, Douglas, and Elbert counties here in the state of Colorado. We're a national organization across the entire 50 states of the United States. We work specifically with people with disabilities, intellectual and developmental, to just better and broaden their lives. Here in Colorado, we have 15 chapters that support people for free across the state. So if you know of anyone in the state of Colorado that needs support, they can reach out to any ARC chapter and we can get them connected to the right one. We do advocacy here, so we help them program and process and access the supports and things they need throughout their lives. To start off, like Bob said, I've been in the field my entire life. Our babysitters were adults with disabilities. My parents grew up helping what we call deinstitutionalize the state of Colorado. So when I say intellectual and developmental disabilities, most people think of Down syndrome or autism. There's about 100 different disabilities in between those, all with differing names and differing, strengths and needs areas. So Down syndrome is the most well-known. I mean, autism is definitely coming up pretty quick behind them, but Down syndrome is also the most well-known because it's been around the longest. Down syndrome has a physical component. So if you know of anyone with Down syndrome, it's very, very rare for them not to have those physical characteristics. It's possible, but it's less than 1% don't have physical characteristics of someone with Down syndrome. So it's been around for centuries, and it's the most studied disability in the network. Again, autism is trying to rival that here in the last few decades, but definitely Down syndrome, you were diagnosed very early on in your from birth, essentially, or now prenatal, that you'll be having a child with Down syndrome. Because of that, and we were able to study things, there's been a lot more work with Down syndrome. One of the things that the doctor talked about is that lifespan for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is going up. It's going up for all disabilities across the plane, Down syndrome being one of them. Because of the rise of medical technology, we're catching up on things. So an example is most individuals with Down syndrome are born with a heart murmur or a hole in their heart. And when I was born in the mid 80s, early 80s, they had to have open heart surgery. And they weren't able to get that until around 3 or 4 years old. Now they're getting it within the first 3 to 4 weeks. Again, that technology level of being able to do that. So just the physical strain on their body, as you get, the younger we can get something done, as you see, like if you ever broke a bone when you were 6, it heals a lot faster than when you break a bone when you're 60. So that idea of medical technology for people with disabilities has really increased their lifespan to where we're seeing people with Down syndrome and different disabilities living into their 70s, living almost the same lifespan as a non-intellectual or developmental adult. So we work really hard with that in the society, that people with disabilities will live their own independent lives and outlive their parents like the rest of us all are. The intent is, in the human lifespan. Also, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, for their pretty much inception, sadly were institutionalized. They lived at home with mom and dad, and they didn't go to school. They didn't get public education. They didn't get a whole lot of doctor support. They kind of were just live at home until they passed away in their mid-20s, early 30s. Again, for all disabilities across the board, or they went to an institution. Cognitive care centers or institutional care centers aren't always the best for development. So a lot of individuals struggle to use their words, to grow into the human beings and adults they were meant to be, and because of that, had lived shorter lifespans. Now, at least here in the state of Colorado and most states across the country, we have what's called home and community-based services, which are Medicaid-provided services that people can qualify for, that they can live in their own community, at home, again, with family, or in their own apartment, housing, live with a partner, live a normal, natural life the rest of us all aspire to. That's another issue for why their age has dramatically increased over the last 20 years, is being in the community, being around your peers, socializing, being around people with and without disabilities, really impacts your lifespan and your overall, love and care for life. So, um, relating to COVID, I know that was a topic that came up, and the morbidity rate being 10 times for people with Down syndrome was 10 times higher for anyone with intellectual and developmental disabilities. For some reason, most individuals with any IDD either have other medical issues going on, underlying compromised immune systems. They have a lot of struggles sometimes with their own personal hygiene. So wearing a mask, keeping a mask on, washing their hands thoroughly, things like that. And then sadly, some more than some were living in congruent care facilities. And when a disease or an illness gets into a facility like that, it spreads faster than it would, say, between my house and my neighbors. So the disability population in general essentially had a much higher COVID rate. So when those vaccines came out, we pushed hard for the governor here in Colorado to prioritize people with disabilities because our population were dying at a much higher rate if they were contracted COVID. So we struggle with disability and dementia for the main reason is people with disabilities aren't caught, or dementia and Alzheimer's isn't caught in them until much later in the disease's lifespan. Most of the time, someone with Down syndrome or other intellectual or developmental disabilities, memory cognition issues are labeled out as behavioral issues. It's part of their disability, it's part of their behaviors, it's part of their antisocial behavior when they're not wanting to go out and do the same activities they've always wanted to do, and they're starting to withdraw from friendships. They're not able to communicate the same way they had before, or do some of those basic tasks, brushing their hair and teeth, that they might have been able to be independent on or semi-independent on before. Sadly, most families, doctors, caregivers, paid or non-paid here in the state of Colorado and across the U.S., tie that directly to behavioral issues. It's part of their disability, not necessarily part of their aging. Down syndrome, I've seen young adults as early as their early 20s, 29, 28 years old, be diagnosed with early onset dementia. We see almost all individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities will have some memory dementia diagnosis at some point in their lives. They will historically get that much earlier, only because just the onset of their brain and how the brain chemistry is already made up when you have an intellectual or developmental disability and cognitive impairment. Some of the other parts of the brain fire differently and react differently. So sadly, we see that with people with IDD. We'll have that, but again, the diagnosis isn't caught until it's pretty late stage Alzheimer's or dementia, because the little things you would see in what we call a neurotypical individual would be missed because it's tacked on to just their disability. One of the big things with dementia and Alzheimer's is with people with IDD is the people that care and love them the most really should be paying attention to those things and really bringing to those attention around what really does impact their son or daughter or loved one's disability, and is it what that relates to. We talk a lot about to families about also pushing back against your doctor, their primary care physician and things, and not letting people label things as just a behavioral issue. It could be dual diagnosis through mental health, something else is going on, their IDD and diagnosis in general, or that they're having early onset dementia or Alzheimer's. And so pushing back and making them do some cognitive testing, do some memory testing, and tracking how and what they're doing is a big deal for people with disabilities. So, which is something, most families and people don't really look into because the doctor knows best, or, that is part of their behaviors. They've done that before. It doesn't mean that's always the same thing that's going on. We really have started encouraging people with IDD to try and join these drug trials, not only for autism, dementia and Alzheimer's, but for other disabilities and other diseases across the board, because they're part of the human genome, they're part of the species with us, and their brains matter too. And so how drugs and things affect the neurodiverse compared to the neurotypical is helping, really brainstorm and break through for better drugs for all of us. So we work really hard at that here at the ARCs. The ARCs also really push for people with IDD to be their own voice. They have a voice. They have a voice that is loud and proud. And your loved ones, if any of you have someone with intellectual and developmental disabilities, have the same rights as the rest of us do when they turn 18. So we really want them to be able to be empowered and really push for their own way to find that voice. And that is a big key for us in seeing the delay in some of these aging criteria for people with disabilities. The more they're involved, the more they're in part of their community, the more they're part of a system, be it they're working in employment. There's more than making a wage from employment. We all have social peer friend networks. You have self-esteem. You increase your overall, endorphins and overall, other critical brain stimulants going on while working. So we really push for all people with disabilities to really engage in what they can and the level they want to help kind of stave off some of these things. But the most part with IDD and people in general with that is they're part of the human programming. So we need to incorporate that into how we test and look and treat things. So again, as Down syndrome being the highly most studied disability, because it's been well known for so much longer, I can say probably if we had this conversation in about 10 years, autism will definitely be shooting up the ranks, because we don't have a ton of older adults with autism. We have a lot of older adults with undiagnosed disabilities or other diagnoses that, with terms like IDD, general, moderate, ideas that were probably autism or autistic spectrum at some point, that will be aging into their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s in the next handful of years. And we'll be able to see how their brains and things develop into the aging adults in this country. So, I'm here to take some questions. That's really kind of just our statement here with the ARC. Some of the biggest takeaways is also just, making sure you're paying attention to your loved ones and how they look and work and interact with their environment. That's a big takeaway from, is this something we need to get tested or something we need to look more into? So again, the ARCs, if you need an ARC anywhere in the country, the ARC of the US has a Find My Chapter page. You type in your zip code and it literally will list out any chapter within your zip code that can help you. Here in Colorado, we're all free. We're here to help. And again, we do cover the entire state here with advocacy and support. Again, thank you for your time today. Bob, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Luke. That was really very informative, very good. And I'm going to share my screen for just a minute and show the map that you had provided to me before, Luke. And so this shows where.
So those are the chapters here in the state of Colorado. I'm the green area, so the Arapahoe, Douglas, and Elbert County. There is a chapter in our own backyard, the Arc of Aurora, that we share part of Arapahoe County with. But all the other colors are other chapters. The gray area is served by the Arc of Colorado. That's just the state chapter. You can tell they're a little more the rural, harder to get to some of the areas in the state. They do have an advocate that does go travel there or does Zoom now. But they do advocate for those areas of the state. So we covered the entire state.
Okay, thank you. And when you talk about services, what just briefly, what services do you actually provide?
So the ARCs provide what's called advocacy. So we provide support and services through advocacy from birth to death. So the whole lifespan of someone with intellectual and developmental disabilities. As kids, it's IEPs, 504, special education stuff. For adults, we have essentially helping them navigate Medicaid, Social Security, the waiver programs, which are the home and community-based services that actually provide the direct care. So someone finding them a job, them living in someone's home or living on their own with supports coming in to maintain their environment. So those are the supports for adults, along with other low-income supports that food stamps, SNAP benefits, LEAP, things like that people can benefit from in the state of Colorado. So The arts can help connect families and navigate people with disabilities through those networks and make sure they're connected and they're not falling through the cracks, or kind of educating them because nobody knows what they don't know. I see the Arc of Larimer County is great. They've done a great job up there with David, their new executive director, and a bunch of friends of mine that work up there. So yeah, again, we cover the entire state, and each one of us is a little unique of how we might operate everyday things, but in the long run, we're all here to serve and help people with IDD.
Okay, thank you. We have 10 minutes. I'd like to open it up for questions from anybody in the audience who has a question that they haven't already asked through the chat. But if you'd like to ask Dr. Granholm or Kelly, Luke. Okay. I had a couple that I wanted to circle back on. One for Kelly, and the research that's being done, is that being done all over the world, all over States, the Alzheimer's funded research, that is, well, and the NIH too, and I'm sure a lot of will chime in on this too, but please start with you, Kelly.
Yeah, I think it's very fair to say that research is happening across the globe. The Alzheimer's Association alone is funding projects in over 48 countries. So as an academic and someone who understands the scientific and academic process, the ability to share information that is accurate and scientific is so critical. And so the Alzheimer's Association not only desires to fund a large scale of research, but also they look to convene researchers to accelerate the speed. And so that is done specifically through our Alzheimer's Association International Conference on Research. And this is an annual gathering where people from across the globe come together and share ideas and information and their findings as it relates to the studies they're working on, to share with their colleagues who may not be at their university or within their lab, to advance the research. So that's kind of a role in the scientific community that we're really proud to play. And I know, Dr. Granholm, Lotta, you've been likely a recipient of some of our funding. And so to me, this is just such an interesting kind of moment of putting all the pieces together. I don't know what you want to share about that, but to me, that brings to life how science happens.
It's very prestigious, and I received a grant, and also my former graduate student, Eric, that I talked about, just got a grant from Alzheimer's Association. So it's a great support especially for younger scientists coming into the career, or other scientists from other fields who want to switch field and work on Alzheimer's. So the funding that has increased in Alzheimer's research, because of all the efforts from people from Alzheimer's Association and many individuals, has really allowed us to make great breakthroughs, I think, in research. It's interesting because, I used to go visit a lot more lobbyists and senators and talk about funding for Alzheimer. And many of them said to me, especially in South Carolina, there was not big interest in funding research. And they said, well, how do you know that you're going to have success if we increase research funding to Alzheimer? And I said, well, you can only look at the cancer field and the cardiovascular field. There was a big effort to increase funding there 20 years ago, and it has resulted in more survival. So I think, adding money to it is what's going to make the difference. I really do think.
So Lotta, as a researcher yourself, how do you network? With all the other researchers around the world that are doing this kind of research, and keep up to date on what other people are doing, and they know what you're doing? And how does that work?
Well, it's gotten a lot easier after the pandemic, I'll tell you, because this morning and also yesterday, I had meetings with several European countries, and Zoom has certainly made that easy for us. But, we have, there's a couple of conferences that people go to every year. So, the big AAIC one that's in Amsterdam in July. And now in 2 weeks, there's a conference in Gothenburg. And that's an interesting one because it combines Parkinson and Alzheimer research. And so you can actually look at common pathways and you can think about the overlap between these conditions. So it becomes your friends and your family. I mean, and you spend your vacations with people who also are researchers. So it really becomes a lifestyle, I would say.
I guess you talk about plaques and tangles over martinis in the evening too, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's when the best decisions are made. And red wine. Don't forget the red wine.
Oh yeah, of course. I should have said red wine.
Yeah.
And one quick other question for you, Lotta, and this is just, a curiosity for me, but how did it feel the first time you actually held a brain in your hands?
It's in awe. I was in awe. It's a gift. It's like a fantastic gift to research. And so I just really couldn't believe that somebody had been so selfless and donating, their organs so that we could find out more about the disease. It's a really, I think of it as it's a richness. I feel rich. I have tissue samples from all over the world, and I send tissue samples to all over the world. Anyone that wants any tissue for research, it's free. In the cancer world, they share cancer tissue, but they charge money for it. We have decided in the brain research field, and especially in Alzheimer, that we're not going to charge anything. We're sharing freely. We share animal models, we share brain tissue. It's really, it makes us rich, in experience and understanding the brain.
All right. Yeah, that's cool. Thank you. And I've had a question for Luke. Now I forgot what it was. Oh, I know what it was. You mentioned that the second leading intellectual and developmental disability behind Down syndrome will overtake Down syndrome at some point in time. Why is that?
Well, I mean, Down syndrome is a genetic kind of component, to it. So we can test and see when things are coming up. Overall, overall health of the mother prior to things is also, understanding your genes and what's going on. But autism is a new disability, newer. I mean, in the world of disabilities, I mean, 36, 40-year-olds have it, but 50 and 60-year-olds aren't diagnosed with autism per se. They might be now being put on the autism spectrum, but years ago they weren't. And there's a lot of money. So the state of Colorado does a really pretty decent job of throwing money at people when they're younger. The doctor talked about getting things done when they were younger can definitely help develop that brain and move things forward. So we have a few programs here in the state of Colorado. One, early intervention, which is just kind of a general kind of delay, but helps a lot of kids. We have child waiver programs that help people across the community, and then some other things through your private insurance if you can't qualify for Medicaid to get that done. The idea is the more money we throw at kids, the less we'll see issues kind of behavioral wise as they become adults. So autism is just kind of in its infancy still as an intellectual and developmental disability. And more people are kind of falling into that autism spectrum. And it is a spectrum. We don't have this kind of low functioning and high functioning anymore. It's people that neurotypical people can be in that autism spectrum, and they just have some unique quirks and things to them, where then you have individuals in the autism spectrum that need a lot more level of support to kind of get their lives and things in place. And then there's diseases that fall into the autism spectrum, like Fragile X, which is part of the autism spectrum, but its own issue within its, but also has a chromosome component to it. So because of that, and the research being thrown into disability research, again, we're behind autism, is a lot, just groundbreaking with how they're moving forward with trying to get people with disabilities to just be part of the community. So yeah, in the next 10 or 15 years, autism will probably be one of the most highly diagnosed disabilities across the spectrum.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much. A lot of Kelly, Luke, wonderful presentations, and I think our audience really got a lot out of this talk today. So, and thanks to the audience for joining us today.
And thank you,
And-
Bob, for organizing this.
Oh, you're very welcome. And as I said earlier, this has been recorded, so it will be on our website in a few days, and we'll be sending out a note telling you when it's ready. So thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.